Hello everyone, today I'm going to be explaining the benefits of extensive reading from a connectionist perspective. So here's a quick overview of what we'll be talking about. As for my puzzle, I was studying Korean language while I was living in Korea quite intensively. Living in the host culture, of course, I had the opportunity to use Korean regularly. But I noticed that my oral fluency was quite underdeveloped. So I turned to extensive reading, which means basically reading for enjoyment and reading books that are written with language at a level that I understood quite readily. And the result was that I felt, as did my Korean friends, that my fluency improved greatly. And ultimately I was able to form personal relationships in Korean. So my puzzle is, being that usually we expect to improve our fluency by practicing speaking, but I noticed that somehow by doing receptive skills practice, it had a beneficial effect on a productive skill. And I'll try to explain this using the theory of connectionism. So the idea is that language acquisition is emergent, and emergentism basically contrasts with Chomskyan ideas and the ideas of the language acquisition device. Instead of having an innate neurological module, emergentists would say that our sense of what's permissible in the language basically emerges from our brains working on all the language input that we receive over our lifetimes. So connectionism tries to explain this emergent nature as being due to simple learning mechanisms. And connectionists use computer models or artificial neural networks to demonstrate how this could be. And if we look at diagrams of their models, it usually consists of circles connected by lines or nodes with connections between them. And the biological correlate, of course, is the neuron, which can receive information and transmit it along the axon. I'll let you read up a little bit on that, but this is the simple processing unit that connectionists are basically trying to emulate. So Plunkett and colleagues in 1992 used a connectionist model to explain lexical development. And what they basically did to train the model, they used a series of pictures. So let's say, for simplicity's sake, let's say that they were using different pictures of horses of different sizes and colors and whatnot. And they would show these pictures together with the word horse, and that would correspond to the label. And this information would be propagated from this layer of input units to the inner layer of units, as would the label input, i.e. the word horse. And gradually over time what happens is there's a representation that forms here in the hidden units. It happens very gradually. And the model can undergo further training by showing just an image of a horse that it has never seen before, and this should produce the word horse over here in the output. That would be an example of a production task. But the reverse can also be done. You can train it by showing it the word horse over here in the label input, and an image of a horse should appear over here in the output, showing that the model has comprehended the word that was put into it. it runs on a learning algorithm which is programmed into it. It's called backpropagation. So if I, for example, show it a new image of a horse, it ought to produce the word horse over here in the output, and then I can signal to the model that the output was correct. Conversely, if I showed a picture of a unicorn over here in the input and it produces the word horse over here in the output, we can signal to the model that it was incorrect. And backpropagation means basically that feedback, positive or negative, will be fed backwards through the system along all the connections that produce that output. And that brings us to the idea of weighting. And this is another property of these systems. Basically, if the output is correct, so it gives the word horse for an image of a horse, I give it positive feedback and all the connections that produce that output are strengthened. And conversely, if I showed a unicorn and it tells me it's a horse, the negative feedback is fed through the system and all the connections are weakened. So by doing this, we have a dynamic system in which the connections can change over time. They can be strengthened or weakened based on the performance and based on the feedback that we give it. Now, the interesting thing that Plunkett and colleagues found was that if this system was trained on both production and comprehension tasks, as opposed to just one of them, the learning that resulted would be much faster. And I think this may apply to my puzzle in that there seems to be a synergistic effect between receptive skills practice and productive skills practice, as represented in this model by the production task and the comprehension task being done together. So I think we're going to skip over this just for the sake of time, but basically connectionists think that production and comprehension result from the same mechanism as we've just seen in the model. In another study by Ellman, he trained a computer model with full sentences, and then he tested it by feeding sentences into it word by word, and he found that the computer model was able to predict the part of speech of the word that was to follow. So we could say that it had actually learned grammar or syntax. And when we look into the hidden units of this model, you can see that it had, its internal representations had formed lexical families, so organized by semantic meaning, as well as more abstract organizations of the grammatical function of these words. So back to my puzzle, I'm hypothesizing that the strengthening of the connections in the common network, the network that both receptive skills and productive skills draw upon, this common network was being strengthened by my extensive reading. And as for fluency, well, we learned in our course that when children receive input, they likely identify chunks from the input and eventually analyze the parts of those chunks over time. And Ellis, one of the connectionist researchers, noted that we seem to chunk everything from letters and sounds all the way up to longer stretches of discourse. So again, I'm thinking that the extensive reading that I did strengthened the connections that already existed in the chunks that had been stored in my mind. And it's important to note also that there are hierarchical representations formed as well. So as we saw, more abstract representations are formed, such as part of speech and syntax and even complex grammar. So the thing about formulaic sequences or chunks and fluency, first of all, it's proposed that a lot of, perhaps even up to 80% of our language is formulaic. And this allows us to bypass the encoding mechanisms when we're speaking. So these activation patterns, as connectionists would call them, or chunks, allow for greater fluency on our part. So to sum up, I believe that the extensive reading that I did in Korean provided additional input into my brain. I already had existing connections or chunks that existed in my mind because of my language study, and these connections or chunks were strengthened by the additional input of extensive reading. And I'm proposing, well, first of all, that in itself should increase fluency, but as we saw, productive skills practice and receptive skills practice resulted in faster learning in the Connectionist model by Plunkett and colleagues. And so I'm wondering if this synergistic effect may also have been a factor resulting in increased fluency on my part. So the significance for we language educators, I believe, is primarily in motivating students to begin reading in L2. It always helps when you're trying to convince your students of a given learning strategy that it always helps to explain it and explain the theory behind it to get them to, well, buy into it, I suppose. And we could say the same for your director of studies or your language school owner. Perhaps they need a little push to get that graded reader library started. And I hope that this presentation has given a theoretical basis for that. And of course, some learners don't really like to read even in their L1, but it stands to reason that the same would apply for extensive listening. So this theoretical basis could also be used to, I guess, coax your students into listening to podcasts and TV in the L2 that they are studying as well. So that's all for my presentation. If you have any question or comments, please log into your Google account, write them below, and I'll be happy to get back to you.